December 1983. We're in Apple's boardroom in Cupertino, California. The most expensive commercial in the company's history just finished playing. Then Apple's chairman, Mike Markkula, breaks the tension. Well, who wants to find us a new ad agency? Every single board member, venture capitalists, Fortune 500 CEOs, the smartest money in Silicon Valley, hated what they had just seen. But here's what they didn't understand. They were witnessing the birth of a different kind of brand. One that would rather bet the company and the creative future of the company rather than play it safe. This is the story about how Steve Jobs and a band of rebels learned the most dangerous lesson in business. Sometimes the room full of smart people is wrong. And sometimes being right means being willing to creatively sacrifice everything. Welcome to Creative Discipline. If you listen to enough stories about businesses, founders, and the creative that they push out there, you see a pattern. The breakthrough moment never comes from consensus. It comes from one person or a small group of people refusing to back down. Steve Jobs in 1983 was 28 years old. He'd already built Apple into a billion-dollar company, but he was about to learn something that he would employ and define the rest of his career. The distance between being revolutionary and unemployed is one bad bet. Think about it for a second. We see the same pattern everywhere. Bezos put everything on AWS when everyone said stick to books. Musk poured everything from his PayPal fortune into Tesla and SpaceX when experts said it would both fail. Reed Hastings bet the entire future of Netflix on streaming when his board said it's company suicide after they'd already won the battle of rental with Blockbuster. The pattern is always the same. Creative breakthrough requires going against the conventional wisdom of all the smart people in the room. And Jobs was about to make the biggest bet of his life. What we're talking about is the 1984 ad that they ran at the Super Bowl. That's kind of the iconic when things shifted for marketing. So we're going to talk about the entire history of this, how it has changed marketing forever, what are the things you can learn about making creative bets, and the discipline that it took to make those things happen, and how it can empower you to be better and make bolder bets in the future, but knowing that you can stay disciplined in the process. Act 1, the mind of a rebel. Let me paint you a picture of the computer industry in 1983. IBM owned everything, 60% market share. Their ads were all the same, gray suits, corporate offices, technical specifications. The saying was, nobody ever gets fired for buying IBM. This wasn't just a slogan, it was religious doctrine. Now, I want you to understand why Steve Jobs' decision was so radical and why you need to understand what he was up against. IBM in 1983 was like Google and Microsoft combined today. Not market cap because those numbers are bigger, but the mind space that they occupied kind of in the American and global consciousness when it came to technology. They didn't just dominate. They defined what computers were supposed to be. Their CEO, John Opel, was featured on the cover of Time magazine. He was called the Colossus that works. Think about that for a second. When you think Colossus, there is a kind of grand, I think of the Colossus of Rhodes, but there is kind of this grand picture. IBM was Colossus. IBM's annual revenue, 1983, $40 billion. Apple was $1 billion. This is the equivalent of a startup deciding to take on Apple, Google, and Microsoft simultaneously today. And Steve Jobs was about to commit heresy. Here's what most people get wrong about this story, though. They think the 1984 commercial was about Mac. It definitely was not about Mac. It was about Steve Jobs learning to think like a creative maverick, about wanting to be more right than play it safe. We have a lot of these things in our lives today, right? Like we want to be able to hedge our bets. This is why we all lean on data so much. But there is something that I heard from Mark Zuckerberg, was opinion-based decisions. When you're in a leadership position or in a position to make meaningful change in the company that you work for, especially let's use the creative arena, there is discipline around how you plan things. There's discipline around how you measure things. But then you have to make decisions based on opinion. And when you're uniquely positioned to understand all the context around your business and see into the future around what you're forecasting the ability of your company to have in the market or who you're competing against, you're going to have to make bold bets. So let me show you what I mean about being right rather than playing it safe. Chiat Day was the agency of record for Apple at the time. They pitched a concept, a $1.7 million dystopian film that didn't show the product. This is a challenge to do today, 40 plus years removed from this creative going live, let alone 40 years ago when every single thing in marketing was centered around product so you can visualize it so that you can go and take action on it. Very, no matter even if it was on TV, it was still very DR focused. You know what Steve Jobs said to this? This is it. IBM is Big Brother, and we're the rebels. Notice what he didn't say. He didn't ask about market research. He didn't worry about the competition. He didn't hedge. He made an identity decision in real time. If you know your business backwards and forwards, and you've done all the disciplined things about learning about your customer, understanding them, doing the market research yourself, when an idea hits, when that ephemeral magical idea hits, you've done the disciplined thing to now take the creative action that you need to take. This is what separates the maverick creatives from just standard executives. Executives optimize. These creative mavericks, founders, whoever you are, decide who they are. And Steve Jobs had decided. Apple wasn't selling computers. They were starting a revolution. Act 2, the psychology of creative courage is what I want to talk to you about. Now, I need to tell you about the environment at Apple in 1983. Steve Jobs had created something very, very interesting. There was the Mac team that worked in a separate building called the Texaco Towers because it was literally behind a gas station. And Steve Jobs hung a pirate flag from there and from the roof of that building. And their slogan was, it's better to be a pirate than join the Navy. This wasn't corporate theater. This was psychological warfare against his own company. This is something that will happen when you get from this early growth stage into the optimization phase. And this is kind of the whole, there's the stars and sentinels framework that I like, which is when you're early and growing at all costs, you have a bunch of stars growing your business, helping make sure that you're able to change the world. Once there's enough money on the table, and in certain cases like Apple's, there are venture capitalists involved, you start having people who are supposed to protect the business, i.e. sentinels, which is professional CEOs, accountants, attorneys, and their job, HR folks, their job is to make sure that the people who created the value don't destroy the value that's already been created, and they're able to build a more durable system. The challenge is when those two things diverge in real time, you're going to have some tension around, and there was a lot of tension at Apple. Steve Jobs in this time understood something most people forget. Your biggest enemy isn't your competition. It's sometimes your own organization's immune system. Let me break down what I mean by that. Every company develops antibodies against risk. So this is that stars and sentinels thing that I'm talking to you about. And the bigger you get, the stronger they become. So Jobs physically separated his team. Different building, different culture, different rules. He created a parallel company inside his own company, the Rebels. When Lee Clow at Chiat Day saw the script, he said something that would change advertising forever. It's not enough to say 1984 won't be like 1984. We have to shatter people's image in their minds. One thing we have to think about, and I'll go into the visuals of this. 1984 is a book that a lot of people have read in high school, but at the time, it was a lot more part of the public consciousness, especially because it was coming on 1984. Think of it like 1984 was something that people were thinking of. We were still in the Cold War. Obviously, we were coming off of Vietnam, and a lot of and some people's parents were post-McCarthyism, etc. So this thing was still in the public consciousness around people watching and the world kind of turning into this dystopian future. Now, 40 years later, we still have these feelings, etc., etc. But this book was a very significant part of the zeitgeist of the time. And what they conceived was a sledgehammer. It's their version of the bone getting thrown into the air in Space Odyssey. But here's what was really happening though. Jobs is learning to think in metaphors, not features, right? Every single person goes in feature vomits in a lot of these situations. We have this. People don't respond to features. They respond to stories. They respond in things that they can connect to their own personal lives. A feature about what your product does for them. Hey, this is sweat wicking. I don't care if it's sweat wicking. Show me a person who looks like me who's working out in that situation. Most founders or creatives or teams, especially as they build these antibodies to risk, they get trapped selling what their product does, not what their product means. So this is the discipline, right? You have to continuously push your teams to go with what the product means. What is the story behind it? And Steve Jobs was a master at this. He had great creative partners at Chiat Day, no doubt, but he always distilled everything down to the first principles core of what his customers needed and what the stories behind what they needed were. He wasn't just selling a computer. He was selling a hammer that shatters conformity. You shop with Apple. You're one of the crazy ones. One of his next campaigns in the 90s in his return back to Apple, Act 3. So I'm going to give a little preamble on this. We're going to go to 1983, that board meeting that we started with. The kind of funny thing is, in about 2 months before this, October of 1983, Apple had a conference with their entire team at in Hawaii, and he screened this for the team. Standing ovation. Everyone was super excited about being part of the Rebel Alliance, right? They understood it at a core level. This was who they were. They were excited to brace this mentality. We're fighting the man, aka IBM, and what they're doing and the kind of mediocre experience that they're giving to customers. The challenge. 1983 boardroom screening. Arthur Rock, the legendary VC who funded Intel and Apple, Dr. Henry Singleton from Teledyne, Mark Markkula, who we talked about at the beginning, and Phil Schlein, who is the CEO of Macy's, not the Macy's of today, the Macy's of 1983, behemoth. I want to tell you a little bit about these people, just dive a little bit deeper. Arthur Rock wasn't just any investor. He was the guy who coined the term venture capital. He funded Fairchild Semiconductor, Intel, and Apple. Absolutely pristine track record. Guy minted unicorns before unicorns were a thing that we even talked about. Henry Singleton built Teledyne into a $3 billion conglomerate through 130 acquisitions. This guy knew business inside and out. Warren Buffett called him one of the great capital allocators in business history. Mark Markkula was an ex-Intel executive who wrote Apple's first business plan and turned Jobs and Wozniak from garage tinkerers into a real company. So these are kingmakers or kings themselves. These weren't just, and they weren't just rich guys. They were people who literally built the Silicon Valley that we know today, the commercial ends. Phil Schlein literally puts his head in his hands. The unanimous verdict. This is the worst fucking commercial we have ever seen in our lives. Note, they've seen a lot of commercials. This is where our story gets interesting though, because what happens next reveals everything you want to know about great creative mavericks, founders, whoever you are, and how they think under pressure. CEO John Scully, who we've all heard about, and he's supposed to be the adult in the room, he panics. These people are his bosses, not Steve. He orders Chiat Day to sell the airtime back. Now, Chiat Day had, again, the agency that had created all of this stuff, they had bought 2 spots, 30-second and 90-second. But Jay Chiat, the agency founder, made a decision in real time. Another rebel. He made something that would make him a legend in advertising. He lied to his biggest client. He sold the 30-second spot, but he told Apple he couldn't find a buyer for the 60-second spot. Now, some of this may be apocryphal, but let's just go with the idea that it is real. He's gambling his entire agency on the conviction that this will work. This is the behavior of a maverick, not employees, but actual maverick founder level behavior. Now, the thing is, I have had employees, I've been the employee that is doing the maverick thing because they know that they have conviction around this. The idea is, how do you create a system with which you can have these kind of thinking and this kind of intentionality and intensity thrive? Steve did that, moved his squad to the Texaco Towers, hung a pirate flag, working directly with Chiat Day, letting them know that he's willing to spend $900,000 to $1 million on just the production, not even the spots, before it's even done. Right? Him and Woz coming into the next story that I'm going to tell you. Steve Wozniak now enters this story. Was kind of semi-retired at the time, but he still was beloved within Apple. Obviously, a great friend and partner to Steve Jobs. So the Steves watched the commercial together. Steve loved it. Steve Wozniak loved it. Said, sci-fi should be. And again, Ridley Scott directed this commercial, fresh off the success of Blade Runner. I could get into that a little bit, but when he heard that the board didn't want to do it and wanted them to sell the spot, he looked Steve Jobs dead in the eye and said, "I'll pay for half of the spot if you will. $400,000 to run a 60-second spot on something that board is trying to neuter with them, all on the conviction that this will change the course of the history of their brand." One thing I like to talk about is a slope changer. They had conviction that this was a slope changer, and they had no way of knowing. There was no way of modeling the data. This was we know our customers. We have done the disciplined work. We are ready to make this bet on the business. He was willing, their co-founder was willing to personally fund this commercial. He understood something that the board didn't. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is play it safe. This moment captures something that I think you'll see in great partnerships that you can have internally with your teams. When Wozniak looked at that commercial, he didn't see an advertising risk. He saw Apple's soul. This is something that I'm not able to get across in maybe a conversation because people are getting defensive because of this one-on-one format. I'm going to share this with you. Your company has a soul. You, whether you're a founder, a creative director, wherever you sit, you're a steward of that soul and you're interacting with outside forces. And we get into the day to day, we have things that, targets we need to hit, etc. The question is, what is more important long term? There are days where the soul of your company is your P&L, right? Because you just have to survive and you have to shovel shit and that is totally fine. But your loyalty is to the soul of that company and what it needs to survive and ultimately thrive and become the best version of itself. That's not loyalty. That's a shared psychosis that you can have about what your company represents. Again, this all comes back to this idea of discipline, though. You have done the disciplined work to build a company and build a structure and build the thinking around it and understanding your customers right away at a deep core level so that when you see things like this, you have the conviction of a moment, right? You have the conviction of a moment. Next, I want to go to Act 4. The gamble paid off, obviously, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. Let's look at the creative.
In all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests of a contradictory force. Unification of force is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Wow. I've watched that 10 times in preparation for this, and I'm still getting chills. The gamble pays off. January 22nd, 1984, Super Bowl 18, 96 million viewers. The commercial airs just once, only one time, and it changes everything. The network replays it for free. News shows cover it. And within 100 days, Apple sells $155 million worth of Macintoshes. 1983 dollars. They get $5 million within a week of earned media across all of the coverage that they're getting. And there's like two poles, right? There's no like, it's okay. Either people love it or they despise it. Either way, they get a reaction, which is the only real thing. If you're in the middle, you're nowhere, right? You either want people to really love what you're doing or hate what you're doing, and you can optimize from there. There's a deeper lesson. A week after the launch, Apple's board holds a meeting. The Mac team walks in. The entire board, the same people who 2 months beforehand were talking shit and saying this is the worst commercial that they've ever seen, gave them a standing ovation. Standing ovation. This is the most important part of the entire story. This is why I wanted to tell you this story, because it reveals something profound about leadership and about the creative mind that no one can really understand until they're in it. And when they understand their customers, they understand the market, and they understand the stories that they're trying to tell and the stories that they're trying to extract in people's lives and help them with. A room full of smart people can be completely wrong, and they can completely change their minds. You heard Huberman talk about neuroplasticity. This is success obviously solves everything. You have to be willing to make bets to get there. Most people never recover from that kind of rejection. Put their head down. They say, these are smart, powerful people. We're going to do what we're told. They assume the smart money knows something they don't. Steve Jobs learned the opposite lesson. Sometimes. Smart money is smart about everything except for the thing that matters most, the thing that actually changes slope. Maybe those folks were there to make sure that the business ran well, but not actually how to change the business. Act 5, the creative lesson. I'm going to tell you about what really happened in 1983. Steve Jobs didn't just bet on a commercial. He bet on a way of thinking that would define his entire career, a way that would change Apple in his second act even more than it changed Apple in its first act when he was there. He learned to trust his own judgment over expert consensus. Sometimes you've got to just trust your gut and let it rip. Everyone is going to tell me that that is really easy to say from the cheap seats, I run a bootstrap company. I do it every day. You make some mistakes, you hit some singles, you hit some doubles, you strike out sometimes, but you've got to trust your own conviction. And the more you run these trust cycles with yourself, and the more discipline and rigor you put towards the decision making, the easier and faster it's going to be to make great decisions and also to live with them and move forward. When he got fired from Apple 2 years later, he didn't doubt himself. He started next. He acquired and expanded Pixar. Then he returned to Apple in 1987. His first campaign he approved, Think Different. It was a direct descendant of 1984. Here's what's fascinating. When he came back to Apple in 1997, the company was 90 days away from bankruptcy. Most CEOs would have played it safe, focused on operations, cut costs, played defense. This is the standard playbook in cash-strapped situations. What did Steve Jobs do differently? Well, he did the exact opposite. He launched Think Different, another expensive product-free campaign that celebrated rebels and misfits because he learned a lesson. Safe thinking is the most dangerous thinking of all. The commercial wasn't a product. The mindset was the product. Here's what I want you to understand. Every creative thinker, every rebel faces their boardroom moment. The room goes quiet. The experts shake their heads. The smart money says no. The data is against you. But that's not the end of the story. That's where your story begins. Because what separates these founders, creatives, rebels, builders from everybody else isn't intelligence or connections or even capital. It's the willingness to be right when everyone else is wrong, and also the willingness to be wrong when everyone else is right. And that courage to bet everything on possibility, that's what Jobs learned in that boardroom moment. Consensus is the enemy of breakthrough. You can tell my conviction. The moment everyone agrees with you is the moment you stop thinking like a builder. That's why I love this commercial. That's why I love this story. This is one of the most important moments for one of the most important businesses that was ever created. Not because of what it sold, but because of what it taught. The DNA that it created in Apple, right? The first $1 billion worth of sales. They were building things. They were starting a movement. This solidified how Steve Jobs felt about everything. And he pulled it into Next. He pulled it into Pixar. And those things made it even more deeply ingrained in him. So that when he came back to Apple, not only did he know what to do, but he actioned on it with a ruthless effect. And the last thing I want to share with you on this, think about every breakthrough you admire. iPhone, Tesla, Netflix streaming, Amazon Web Services. Every single one was rejected by smart people with good reasons. Steve Jobs learned the lesson the hard way that your biggest competition isn't other companies. It's the voice in your head that says maybe they're right. And it takes discipline, creative discipline, to fight against that. And the pattern is always the same. The thing that seems impossible becomes inevitable. The 1984 commercial ran once during the Super Bowl and never again. But it created a template that every builder should memorize. But it created a template that every founder, builder, creator should memorize. Your biggest breakthroughs will terrify the people around you. Market research will tell you you're wrong. The experts will say it won't work. And that's exactly when you know you're onto something. So let me ask you a question Steve Jobs asked himself in 1983. Are you building something safe enough to get approval by committee? Or are you building something so revolutionary it scares every mother in the room? Because if you're not scaring people, you're not thinking big enough. And you're not willing to bet everything on your vision. You're not thinking like a creative rebel. You've been listening to Creative Discipline, powered by Creative OS. If it's changed the way you think about risk and creativity and the discipline surrounding that, please share it with another builder like you who thinks differently, who challenges you, who forces you to be a better version of yourself. And remember, the room full of smart people is usually wrong about the things that matter most. You know what you need to do. Trust your judgment, make the bet, shatter the screen. I'll see you next week.